What if the United States is preparing for the most dangerous military operation in the Middle East in years? Right now, behind closed doors in Washington, a very specific fear is growing. Not terrorism, not oil, not even regional instability. The real obsession is Iran's nuclear infrastructure. And according to several military analysts, an invisible circle is slowly tightening around it. Satellite activity is increasing. Strategic aircraft movements are being monitored more closely. American military assets are repositioning across the region. And at the same time, the rhetoric coming from U.S. officials is becoming noticeably more aggressive. This is no longer just about diplomacy. This is no longer just about sanctions. For the first time in months, the possibility of direct military action against Iranian nuclear facilities is being openly discussed again. And that changes everything. Because if Washington decides to strike, the consequences would go far beyond Iran itself. We could be looking at a chain reaction capable of destabilizing the entire Middle East within hours. Oil markets could explode. Regional militias could activate immediately. American bases across the region could become targets overnight. And yet, despite those risks, pressure inside the United States appears to be intensifying. Why? Because many in Washington believe time is running out. For years, Iran has continued expanding and reinforcing parts of its nuclear program. Not necessarily to build a nuclear weapon tomorrow morning, but potentially to move dangerously close to a threshold that would permanently change the balance of power in the region. And that possibility is exactly what alarms American strategists, especially because Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites are no longer easy targets. Some facilities are buried deep underground. Others are protected by advanced air defense systems. Several are believed to be designed specifically to survive a major military assault. In other words, if the United States ever decides to act, this would not look like a simple precision strike. It could become one of the most complex military operations of the modern era. And maybe the most dangerous part of all this is the silence. Because historically, before major geopolitical shocks happen, governments rarely announce their intentions openly. Instead, the signs appear quietly. Troop movements, military exercises, strategic warnings, unusual diplomatic language. And according to some observers, those signs are starting to multiply very quickly. Tonight, the real question is no longer whether tensions between Washington and Tehran exist. The real question is this: are we witnessing another phase of political intimidation, or the early stages of a crisis that could push the region to the edge of war? To understand why the situation is becoming so explosive, you first need to understand one thing. Iran's nuclear program is not concentrated in one single location. It is a vast, highly protected network built over decades. And according to Western intelligence assessments, many of these facilities were specifically designed with one scenario in mind: surviving an American attack. Names like Natanz, Fordo, Arak, and Isfahan constantly appear in military reports and security briefings. But these are not ordinary industrial sites. Some facilities are buried deep beneath mountains. Others are reinforced with layers of concrete and advanced underground tunnels. And around them, Iran has built increasingly sophisticated air defense systems meant to intercept missiles, drones, and aircraft. Tehran understands perfectly well that if war ever breaks out with the United States, its nuclear infrastructure would immediately become the #1 target. So for years, Iran has been preparing for that possibility. And that is exactly what worries Washington. Because destroying these sites would not be simple. In fact, several military experts believe some facilities may now be difficult to eliminate entirely without a massive and coordinated operation. We're talking about stealth bombers, cruise missiles, cyber warfare, electronic jamming, potentially multiple waves of strikes. And even then, success would not be guaranteed. That's the terrifying reality behind the headlines. This would not be a clean operation. This would be an extremely high-risk gamble, because attacking nuclear infrastructure carries dangers that go far beyond the battlefield itself. One mistake, one unexpected explosion, one damaged reactor, and the consequences could become catastrophic. Radiation fears, mass panic, regional retaliation, global economic shockwaves, and perhaps most importantly, escalation that nobody can fully control. Because Iran has spent years preparing responses for exactly this kind of scenario. Missile arsenals, drone capabilities, regional proxy networks, cyber attack units. If Tehran believes its survival is threatened, retaliation would almost certainly extend far beyond Iranian territory. American military bases across the Middle East could become immediate targets. Shipping routes in the Persian Gulf could be disrupted within hours. Oil prices could surge violently worldwide. And suddenly, what began as a targeted strike could spiral into a much larger regional conflict. That is why this situation is making governments nervous across the world. Because the issue is no longer simply whether Iran has nuclear ambitions. The real fear is this: what happens if both sides become convinced they are running out of time? History shows that some of the most dangerous wars begin precisely under those conditions, when pressure rises, when distrust becomes total, and when both sides start believing that waiting may be even more dangerous than acting. At the center of this growing confrontation, one name continues to dominate the conversation: Donald Trump. For years, Trump has positioned himself as one of the toughest American leaders when it comes to Iran. During his presidency, he withdrew the United States from the nuclear agreement that had been negotiated under the Obama administration. That decision changed the entire dynamic between Washington and Tehran. Sanctions intensified, economic pressure increased dramatically, and tensions between both countries entered a completely new phase. Trump's strategy was built around one central idea: maximum pressure. The goal was simple: push Iran economically, politically, and strategically to the point where Tehran would either surrender to tougher conditions or face isolation and possible confrontation. But instead of collapsing under pressure, Iran adapted. Its economy suffered heavily, yes, but politically and militarily, Tehran became even more defiant. And today, many analysts believe the situation is more dangerous than it was years ago. Because the language coming from both sides is becoming increasingly aggressive, Trump and several figures close to him have repeatedly insisted that Iran must never be allowed to reach a nuclear weapons threshold, not under any circumstances, not through negotiations, not through delays, and certainly not through weakness. That rhetoric matters, because in geopolitics, words are often signals to allies, signals to enemies, and sometimes signals to military planners. Behind the scenes, American strategists understand that every public statement can shape expectations inside Iran itself. The tougher the message, the stronger the psychological pressure. And according to some observers, that may be exactly the point. Create uncertainty, create fear, force Tehran to believe that military action is genuinely possible. But there's a dangerous side to that strategy, because Iran also has its own internal pressures. Iranian leaders cannot afford to appear weak in front of their population, their military establishment, or their regional allies. So every threat coming from Washington is often answered with even stronger rhetoric from Tehran. And this is where the situation becomes extremely unstable, because both sides are now trapped in a dangerous cycle of escalation. The United States wants to project strength. Iran wants to project resistance. Neither side wants to back down publicly, and historically, that combination has often produced some of the world's most dangerous crises, especially when military forces are already positioned nearby, especially when emotions begin replacing diplomacy. and especially when political leaders start believing that showing weakness could cost them more than risking confrontation. Some analysts believe Washington may still prefer intimidation over actual war, but others warn that once pressure campaigns reach a certain level, controlling escalation becomes much harder, because eventually, one incident can change everything. A missile strike, a drone attack, a naval confrontation, a cyber attack blamed on the wrong actor, and suddenly, leaders who were trying to appear strong may find themselves pushed toward decisions they never originally intended to make. That is why the world is watching this situation so closely, because the closer both sides move toward the edge, the harder it becomes to predict who might step too far first. Now imagine the scenario that military planners and global markets fear the most. The United States launches a direct strike against Iranian nuclear facilities. Not a full-scale invasion, not necessarily a declaration of war, just a limited operation designed to cripple key parts of Iran's nuclear program. At first, Washington presents it as a precise and controlled mission. Strategic bombers enter the airspace, cruise missiles hit underground facilities, cyber attacks disrupt communications and defense systems. Within minutes, explosions are reported near some of Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites. And for a brief moment, the world waits. Because everyone knows the next few hours could change everything. The central question would immediately become, how does Iran respond? And according to many defense analysts, Tehran would almost certainly respond fast. Very fast. Iran has spent years preparing for this exact possibility. Its military doctrine is not based on matching American power directly. It is based on making any attack unbearably costly. That means retaliation could come from multiple directions at the same time. Ballistic missiles targeting American bases across the Middle East, drone attacks against strategic infrastructure, cyber attacks aimed at financial systems or energy networks, armed groups allied with Iran becoming active across several countries simultaneously. And perhaps the most dangerous threat of all, disruption of the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow maritime corridor handles a massive percentage of the world's oil shipments. If Iran attempts to block or destabilize that route, global energy markets could panic almost instantly. Oil prices could skyrocket within hours. Stock markets could collapse under uncertainty. Governments around the world would suddenly face economic shockwaves far beyond the Middle East itself. But the real danger goes even deeper, because once military escalation begins, controlling it becomes extremely difficult. A single retaliatory strike could trigger another response, then another, then another. And before long, what started as a limited operation could evolve into a regional war involving multiple countries. That's exactly why this scenario terrifies diplomats, because modern conflicts rarely stay contained, especially in a region already filled with armed tensions, rival alliances, and competing interests. And there's another factor many people underestimate: psychology. During moments like these, leaders are operating under enormous pressure. Information becomes chaotic. Rumors spread rapidly. Military commanders make decisions in minutes instead of days. And sometimes, countries react not to facts, but to fear. That is how miscalculations happen. That is how wars spiral beyond their original objectives. And according to several geopolitical observers, the current atmosphere feels increasingly dangerous because both Washington and Tehran appear convinced they must project absolute strength. The United States cannot appear weak. Iran cannot appear intimidated. So both sides continue raising the stakes publicly. Meanwhile, military assets continue moving quietly behind the scenes. Carrier strike groups, missile defense systems, strategic aircraft deployments, naval patrols. Every movement is being watched carefully. Because historically, before major geopolitical explosions occur, there are often warning signs hiding in plain sight. And some analysts believe those signs are becoming harder and harder to ignore. Right now, nobody can say with certainty whether the United States is truly preparing for military action against Iran. Even inside intelligence circles, there are different interpretations. Some believe Washington is mainly using pressure and military positioning to force Tehran back into a weaker negotiating position. Others fear something far more serious is developing behind the scenes. But what makes this moment so dangerous is not only the military tension itself, it is the speed at which the situation is escalating. Because once two hostile powers begin operating in a permanent state of confrontation, the margin for error becomes dangerously small. One misunderstanding, one missile launched by mistake, one drone intercepted in the wrong area, one attack carried out by a regional militia, and suddenly, both sides could find themselves trapped inside a crisis neither originally intended to create. That is what worries many geopolitical analysts the most. History has shown repeatedly that major conflicts do not always begin with formal declarations of war. Sometimes they begin with confusion, with panic, with reactions made under pressure. And today, trust between Washington and Tehran is almost non-existent. Every military movement is interpreted as a signal. Every speech becomes a strategic message. Every deployment raises new fears of escalation. And in that kind of atmosphere, perception can become just as dangerous as reality. Because when governments start believing that the other side may strike first, the temptation to act preemptively grows stronger. That is the logic that has pushed nations toward confrontation throughout history. Fear, pressure, miscalculation. And according to some observers, we may now be entering exactly that phase. The so-called circle of death is not simply about military encirclement, it is also psychological. A cycle of pressure where each side keeps pushing harder, trying to avoid appearing weak, while simultaneously increasing the risk of direct confrontation. The United States wants to demonstrate deterrence. Iran wants to demonstrate resilience. Neither side wants to retreat publicly, and the longer this continues, the more unpredictable the situation becomes. What makes this even more alarming is that the consequences would not stay confined to the Middle East. A major conflict involving Iran could impact global energy supplies, financial markets, international trade routes, cybersecurity systems, and military alliances across multiple continents. In other words, this is no longer just a regional story. It is becoming a global strategic risk. And tonight, the world is watching carefully for signs that could reveal what happens next. Not only official speeches, but troop movements, satellite imagery, naval deployments, emergency diplomatic contacts. Because before history changes direction, there are often silent warnings that most people fail to notice in time. And now the biggest question remains unanswered. Are we witnessing another geopolitical power game? Or the opening moments of a crisis that could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East for years to come?